Ever wonder how the moon landing hoax conspiracy theory started? Well, wonder no more. While it is highly likely there were at least a few individuals here and there who doubted man could accomplish such a thing a little over a half century after the end of period in which humans were still hitching up covered wagons, the first to really get the moon landing hoax story going popularly was a writer named Bill Kaysing. So how did he do it? Kaysing self-published a book in 1976 called We Never Went to the Moon, America's $30 Billion Swindle. Released a few years after the Apollo 17 mission in 1972, Kaysing's book popularly introduced some of the most well-known talking points of moon landing deniers, such as that the astronauts should have been killed when they passed through the Van Allen radiation belts, noting the lack of stars in photographs, the missing blast crater below the lunar module, etc. As to how Kaysing came to the conclusion that NASA faked the moon landings, the story, at least as Kaysing tells it, is that in the late 1950s he managed to view the results of a highly secretive internal study conducted by NASA on the feasibility of man successfully landing on the moon that concluded, in his own words, that the chance of success was something like 0.0017%. In other words, it was hopeless. Kaysing doesn't explain how NASA came up with such a precise figure given all the unknown variables at the time, nor why he put the qualifier something like followed by such an extremely exact number. He also did not name the report itself. And in fact, as far as we can tell, NASA never conducted such an all-encompassing study on the feasibility of a successful moon landing in the 1950s. Whether they did or not, however, we did find in our research looking for that report that NASA conducted a feasibility study on the proposed designs for several manned rockets immediately prior to the Apollo program to decide which contractor to use. This, of course, has nothing to do with Kaysing, but we figured we'd mention it as we like to deal in facts, and reading Kaysing's various works has us feeling like we need to be cleansed a little by saying things that are actually true about NASA in this period. In any event, Kaysing would later assert that he determined from this report that there's no way NASA could have improved these 0.0017% odds in the time between the results of this supposed study and the moon landings about a decade later. As to how Kaysing came across the alleged report, for a brief period he worked for Rocketdyne, a company that made rockets for the Apollo program. Not an engineer or having any similar technical expertise whatsoever, Kaysing's background was primarily in writing, earning an English degree from the University of Redlands, after which he naturally got a job making furniture. As for the writing gig he landed with Rocketdyne, his job was initially as a technical writer, starting in 1956, and he eventually worked his way up to head of technical publications. He finally quit in 1963, deciding he'd had enough of working for the man. After quitting, to quote him, the rat race, in 1963, Kaysing traveled the country in a trailer with his family, earning his living writing books on a variety of topics from motorcycles to farming. This brings us to 1969 when he, like most everyone else in the world with access to a TV, watched the moon landing. While watching, Kaysing recalled the supposed NASA study he'd seen all those years ago, as well as the engineers he'd worked with at the time in the late 1950s, claimed that while the technology existed to get the astronauts to the moon, getting them back was not yet possible. He later stated he further thought, as late as 1967, 3 astronauts died in a horrendous fire on the launch pad, but as of 1969 we could suddenly perform manned flight upon manned flight with complete success? It's just against all statistical odds. So how did NASA fake it? He claimed that the footage of the moon landing was actually filmed on a soundstage. When later asked where this soundstage was located, Kaysing confidently stated that it was located in Area 51. As he doesn't seem to have ever given clear evidence as to how he knew this, we can only assume because it's not a proper space-related conspiracy theory if Area 51 isn't mentioned. Kaysing also claimed the F-1 engines used were too unreliable, so NASA instead put several B-1 rockets inside of each F-1 engine. Of course, in truth, these wouldn't have been powerful enough to get the Saturn V into orbit, even if its tanks were mostly empty. And given the frost and ice clearly visible covering certain relevant parts of the Saturn V here, it's apparent the tanks could not have been mostly empty. There's also the little problem that the clusters of B-1s he described couldn't have fit in the F-1 engine bells, and you can see footage of the F-1 engines working as advertised, with no clusters of engines anywhere in sight. Moving on from there, in all initial cases, he also claims astronauts were not aboard. So what did Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins do during the missions if they weren't zipping around in space? In the first edition of his book, Kaysing claims that they flew to Las Vegas, where they mostly hung out at strip clubs when they weren't in their rooms on the 24th floor of the Sands Hotel. He then states that shortly before the astronauts were supposed to begin broadcasting from the moon, all three men arrived on a soundstage deep within the confines of Area 51 and ate cheese sandwiches. He also states that along with cheese sandwiches, NASA provided the men with buxom showgirls while at Area 51. Presumably, this was the only way to pry the astronauts away from the strip clubs. Amazingly, Kaysing also claimed in the first edition of his book that the fake moon landing footage was filmed live and that there was only a 7-second delay between Armstrong and Aldrin's performance and the broadcast the world was watching. How does he know anything of this? Don't know. Moving on. As for the splashdown and recovery, he claims the astronauts were eventually put on a military cargo plane, a Lockheed C-5 Galaxy, and simply dropped from it in the capsule. As for how he knew this, he did provide a source for once, claiming that an airline pilot he talked to had seen the Apollo 15 module drop from a cargo plane. Who this pilot was, what airline he worked for, if he offered any evidence to support his claim, such as a flight log showing him piloting a plane in the area during the time of the splashdown of Apollo 15, or even when he talked to said pilot, however, he fails to mention. As to how NASA was able to keep the lid on things despite nearly 500,000 people working on the Apollo program in some capacity, not just for NASA but countless independent organizations, he claims NASA simply only let those who needed to know the whole thing was a hoax know. So following this reasoning, that means all these scientists, engineers, etc. working on all the components and various facets of the mission were genuinely trying to make the moon landing happen, including knowing the requirements to make it happen and testing everything they made until it met those requirements. Meaning, what was built and planned should have been capable of doing what the mission required, and the rocket rocketing up to space is something well tracked by everyone right down to the Soviets, who would have loved to cry foul if they saw anything amiss. So, as David Mitchell so sagely put, I'm just wondering, we'll still have to build the massive rocket capable of going to the moon. So I was just thinking, if we've built the moon rocket, might it not be cheaper just to pop up to the moon and fake the footage there? On that note, the ridiculousness of many of these claims and how easily they crumple under the slightest bit of scrutiny is likely why, in the 2002 re-release of his book, Kaysing changed his story in various ways, including claiming that the engines on the Saturn V actually did work and that Collins, Aldrin, and Armstrong did go to space after all, instead of going to hang out with strippers in Vegas. He then states that all three men orbited the planet while pre-recorded, not live, footage was shown on Earth. Despite, to put it mildly, straining credibility on pretty much everything he said from start to finish, and him providing absurdly specific details, generally without bothering to provide any evidence whatsoever backing up these claims, and changing those specific details frequently over time, Kaysing's book and subsequent work nonetheless helped spawn a still thriving moon landing hoax conspiracy theory. As for Kaysing, he didn't stop there. He continued to sporadically come up with new allegations against NASA, including that the agency murdered the astronauts and teacher aboard the Challenger explosion. Why would they do this when the whole Christa McAuliffe thing was supposed to be a publicity stunt to get the public more interested in space travel, science, and what NASA was doing? Kaysing states, Christy McAuliffe, the only civilian and only woman aboard, refused to go along with the lie that you couldn't see stars in space, so they blew her up along with 6 other people to keep that lie under wraps. Now, speaking of things that Kaysing said that were ridiculously easy to debunk with even a modicum of effort, we feel obligated to point out that Christy McAuliffe was not the only woman on board. NASA astronaut Judith Resnick was also killed in the tragedy. Kaysing's quality of research and information on full display. Not stopping there, Kaysing also claimed the deaths of the Apollo 1 astronauts were intentional, as one or more of the astronauts aboard was about to blow the whistle on the upcoming hoax plan. And we now feel obligated to point out here that, as previously mentioned, he also used this fire as evidence of NASA lacking expertise to get a man to the moon. Meaning, according to Kaysing, this fire was somehow both intentional to murder a few astronauts and also accidental owing to NASA's incompetence. Kaysing continued to assert that the moon landings were a hoax right up until his death in 2005, in between writing books on cookery, motorcycle safety, farming, taxes, survival, how to subsist on very little money, and travel guides, as well as making occasional appearances on such shows as Oprah, expounding on his conspiracy theory work. On the side, he also promoted microhousing as a solution for homeless people and ran a cat sanctuary called Flock, standing for the love of cats and kittens. So yes, Kaysing was a man whose passions included microhousing, cats, survival, travel, living off almost nothing, and rapidly coming up with conspiracy theories, and he was a very talented writer. If only he'd been born later, because this man was made to be a social media superstar. And if at this point you'd like to know definitively and independent of anything NASA says how we know humans landed on the moon, see the aptly titled video on one of our other channels, Today I Found Out, How Do We Know Man Really Walked on the Moon?